Hi everyone, this is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today we are going to talk about Mercury turning retrograde in the sign of Cancer. So there are a few basic things I want to tell you about this retrograde, give you the time frame and a few basic things you can look for, and then I'm going to run through all of the rising signs and which house Mercury retrograde will be falling in so that you can track it out and see how it might be affecting you personally. All right, so let's begin with just a kind of a real-time look at the clock. I'm recording this on Wednesday, and we're going to see Mercury turning retrograde tomorrow and into Friday. We really start to notice the retrogradation. That would be the 18th into the 19th. And then if we track this out, Mercury falls under the beams of the sun, is combust. We've got the cazimi happening between the 30th and 1st of July, so right in, depending on what time zone you're in and so forth. And then we take Mercury back, going to start rising as the morning star stations and turns direct around July 13th. So that is that's the trajectory for this. Now, there's a couple of really important moments. For example, there's going to be a square between Mercury and Mars around July 8th. I think that's going to be one of the more intense moments of this Mercury retrograde. So you're going to circle your calendars for July 8th as a moment of marked intensity where Mercury retrograde things can be just a little bit more intense or confrontational. If you back it up from there, there's not, a whole lot of traditional aspects taking place from the traditional 7 planets other than that. So that's the gist of it. But we also do on July 4th, we're going to have a lunar eclipse in the sign of Capricorn, and Mercury is engaged with that eclipse, as is Mars again, like the lunar eclipse was at the beginning of June. So a little bit, another round of intense lunar eclipse energy happening. We'll be coming around to that later in June and early July and taking a look at that in depth. So just kind of bookmark that, though, that the July portion of this retrograde, especially between, say, the 6th and about the 8th, right around there, is going to be more intense. Now, all Mercury retrogrades are not the same. They may not affect you as potently as another Mercury retrograde, and I've talked about this in a recent Q&A video that I did on retrogrades, so you might want to go back and watch that. But suffice to say, this retrograde is also being brought to you courtesy of a solar eclipse in the sign of Cancer, which is happening this Sunday on the 21st. So there is definitely a kind of moment of, there's a peaking moment in Cancer coming up. And so that Cancer area of your birth chart is going to be really important. I'm going to do a video on the solar eclipse as well, so stay tuned for that. But just to kind of emphasize, what are the peak moments? Right when it starts and right about when it ends. When it starts, you've got a solar eclipse happening right about the beginning. By the end, a big square to Mars as a lunar eclipse is taking place. So, and these Mercury retrogrades are typically, right around 3 weeks or so that you're dealing with the retrograde. So that's the gist of it. Now, let's talk a little bit generally about what you might notice with Mercury retrograde in the sign of Cancer. First of all, this is the moon sign. And so a Mercury retrograde that's happening in the moon sign will change quite a bit compared to other Mercury retrogrades because its dispositor or its host, the moon, is always changing. It's the most rapidly moving planet that we look at. We call moon and sun planets in ancient astrology. And it is the fastest of the moving visible objects in the sky that we track. And so Mercury retrograde, already a very changeable planetary dynamic that oftentimes points to reversals, revisions, delays, a period of, sort of divine chaos. And, but now we're adding in the fact that as this goes, so it goes along with what the moon is doing. So what that means is that as the cycle of the moon is waxing and waning throughout this Mercury period in Cancer, you're going to see the landscape of this retrograde is very moody. It's very moony. So it's going to shift a lot. And you want to pay attention to some of these key dates. Let me just put the chart back on the screen. I forgot to do those. So the key dates to pay attention to are going to be this Sunday, because that's when we have the new moon in Cancer and the solar eclipse. So that's going to be this moment where whatever Mercury's retrograde is signifying, some retrogrades in general mean reversals, and we're going to be talking about which area of your life that might fall in based on your rising sign in a minute. But the reversals, delays, setbacks, changes, or twists and turns of fate that the retrogrades tend to bring up will also be marked by this new beginning in the sign of Cancer. So that's the first date to pay attention to, is the 21st. Then if we go forward a little bit, you go to that first quarter moon, which is going to be in a pretty tight square with the sun and Mercury around June 28th. And at that time, Venus has just turned direct. Remember, Venus is in Gemini, which is Mercury's sign. So some kind of positive shift and change, maybe a little bit of some work, or a little bit of a feeling of difficulty or challenge, or that, first quarter moons, usually we need to assert ourselves or face some kind of conflict or challenge. But this has the feeling of kind of turning a corner that's really important, and maybe picking up momentum positively. And this retrograde could be a part of that signification. But there may be breakdowns that are a part of it because Mercury's combust the sun. So you kind of got this like a breakthrough moment right around the first quarter moon of this Mercury retrograde cycle. Then tracking the moon, and of course, on July 4th, we've got the lunar eclipse coming through in the sign of Capricorn, and you can see that right here. So that Capricornian eclipse, of course, is happening as Saturn comes back into Capricorn, maybe a little bit more of a restrictive energy, and Mercury is now starting to emerge as the morning star, so that there may be kind of new implementations or new structures that you're trying to implement of some kind in your life, and watching for a little bit of, this is manifesting time, but it's also, manifestation that's colored by an eclipse energy, which means things are peaking or culminating that have a much deeper history, and the changes that we have to make around this time are more substantive and sometimes more challenging, especially due to the Saturnine influence. So facing reality and making difficult changes that we have to make that emotionally might require us to be a little bit more stoic, really. Just, our emotions may not love what we have to do, but there's some necessary changes happening right around July 4th. Now, if we go forward again, Mercury's retrograde is going to continue, and Mercury's going to basically reach the station point right as it's squaring Mars, and the last quarter moon in Aries is taking place. And that last quarter moon is confrontational. It's about releasing something. It's about confronting something, and it might be quite emotionally charged. So you watch for that around July 11th. And then finally, the moon is going to come all the way back around through Cancer, and we're going to have another new moon in Cancer on July 20th. Now Mercury is direct. Then you should really feel reset, emotionally cleansed, ready to kind of refresh in a more, in a way that probably feels more supportive and nourishing emotionally, after going through this more difficult, period where some emotional compromises or hardships or difficulties happen along the way, given the moon cycle and its dynamics and it being eclipse season and everything. So that's just kind of like a brief breakdown. Okay, now what I want to do is talk a little bit about what you can expect from the sign of Cancer. Remember that Cancer is ruled by the moon, and that the moon is going to bring up environmental circumstances that change. So environment can be the body that the soul lives in. It can be the home that you live in or occupy. It can be the environment of your family, heredity, genetics, race, socioeconomic status, gender, basically all different environmental circumstances that we're born into. Doesn't feel like we have a lot of control over them. And our relationship to them has also this weight of history on it. That's why the moon is also related to ancestry and also past lives. So you're thinking about the deeper emotional roots of your life and all those environmental factors that shape who you are, but that aren't exactly who you are either. And our interaction with those factors, whether it's a family member or our living space or something that feels, it's more tender, vulnerable to deal with the Cancerian space. It's like, this is why identity politics has a place in the world at all, because why is it even a conversation? Because our environment conditions who we are, and it is as a force that we are always contending with. And the world, around us. There's so many different environments and things that we privilege or prefer one environmental factor over another, and they compete and they can demonstrate prejudice towards one another. So any of those environmental, I think family, nation, tribe, blood, roots, folk, all of those kinds of things, that the feeling of belonging to something that's environmental, that's around us, or not belonging to something that's around us, those kinds of questions become really important during Cancerian, any kind of Cancerian transit, or to speak of, an eclipse, new moon, a following new moon, a lunar eclipse in the middle of the cycle in opposite sign of Capricorn, plus a Mercury retrograde in Cancer. So a lot of energy on that area. Where do I belong? What feels like home? What nourishes me? What is the real emotionally intelligent response to the world around me? So Cancer is always, it was the sign that was called the gateway of mankind, and was the sign that signified the descent of the soul into the body. Now, when we think about that, you're talking about two things. One, the moon and the material world that we descend into can be the source of nescience, avidya, darkness, ignorance, and forgetting. Or in this world, we can take up a practice of remembering our source, just like the baby, when separated from the womb, wants to stay close to mother. Well, the moon and Cancer is a reminder that, spiritually speaking, we all need to be the midwives of our spirit soul and our spiritual life, that we all have to tend, nurture, and devote ourselves to constantly being in remembrance of our true nature, of our true identity in spirit. And when we do that, the body, the world around us, the environment around us is all used in service to that constant state of remembrance, which is romantic and looks up, like kind of dreamily looks up at the moon in the evening and says, like, I'm not from here, but I remember something that I am from. So how do we keep that memory alive, and the true memory of who we are, versus all of those things that make us temporarily feel satisfied, like I'm a part of this group or I'm a part of that group, and oftentimes those groups don't really last. They can't ultimately satisfy us. I can't tell you how many times I've heard a person say, I just feel like I'm looking for my tribe in readings. And of course, it's a good thing to find community, but it's also important to remember that there's no worldly kingdom here, or group, or any such association that can really make us feel connected to the great mother, to the great source that we're a part of. So that needs to be a constant act of spiritual remembrance. A Mercury retrograde is a great time to reprioritize what we are nurturing, what we are fostering and caring for, and making sure it's those things that will really take us to the well and draw deep, so that our spiritual cup is really full. So those are a few thoughts about Cancer, the Cancer Mercury retrograde, as well as the Cancer eclipses. Now, let's go through the rising signs one by one and just show you what happens when we place each sign on the ascendant, starting with Aries. So this Mercury retrograde is going to focus very purely on the topics of home, family, and living environment if you're an Aries rising, so you can watch for that. If you're a Taurus rising, in the third house, siblings, neighbors, your immediate environment, as well as the topics of learning, speech, communication, technology, watch for changes in those areas. Sometimes even transit or short-term travel, or things like cars, those things can come up. That's if you're a Taurus rising. Now, if you go forward into, like, for example, just as an example with the Taurus rising, because I'm a Taurus rising, my sister is going to have a gender reveal for her baby during this period of time. And that'll happen right around the eclipse. Isn't that the new moon solar eclipse? Newness around sisters and family. If you're a Gemini rising, it's going to hit your financial house, which means there could be changes in your income, business, bills, expenses, or also just the things that you're building or actively making or growing in your garden that may have they could serve some need, or maybe even make you money. If you are a Cancer rising, it's about identity. It's very personal, could be physical or health related, but it's very much about rethinking who you are and what your general life direction is. If you are a Leo rising, this is going to bring up those deeper emotional shadows in the 12th house. It can be about loss or memories of trauma or healing things from the ancestral past or the family past, or things to do with women or mothers or mothering. Also, sometimes there's themes here about children and caring for people who are hurt. If you go forward to Virgo rising, we're talking about the Mercury retrograde in the 11th house of friends and groups and allies and benefactors, people who you may want to align yourself with in some way in order to pursue an ambition or a professional project, or could be a religious, spiritual, or political group, but there's changes happening in such groups. Time to revise the ways in which you participate or what you're doing, or maybe changes within an organization. If you're a Libra rising, the Mercury retrograde is going to take place in your 10th house, which is career. So you're going to watch for the changes coming in through your career. This is doubling up with the eclipses, of course, so pretty big for Libra rising. If you go forward to Scorpio rising, we're talking about faith, religion, learning, spirituality. Maybe the topic of foreign countries or long journeys comes to mind. But the search for truth in general is very important right now if you are a Scorpio rising. We go forward to Sagittarius rising, and we're going to put it in your 8th house, which is going to have to do with those soul contracts that you have with other people. The topic of a spouse or partner's money or resources or inheritance, or also deeper emotional obligations or entanglements that you have with other people will be part of the subject matter. If we go forward to Capricorn rising, we're going to talk right about your relationships, romantic partnerships, business partnerships, interpersonal relationships in general, and maybe some tie into the family in family relationships as well. If you go to Aquarius rising, we're putting this in the 6th house, and that is the place of work, sickness, and to some extent selfless sacrifice or service. So those themes can become very important. Sometimes you have to be careful when you have a Mercury retrograde in this house that some degree of the Mercury retrograde chaos that often comes is not breaking you down or breaking your immune system or your health down. You want to be careful of your health this month if you're an Aquarius rising. But also conflicts around family or family feuds, those things can sometimes come up. The 6th house was traditionally called the joy of Mars, so it can be a little bit difficult to have intense energy in the 6th house in general right now. Anyway, and then finally we have Pisces rising. We're going to put that retrograde in your 5th house, which is the place of children and pregnancy. Those topics can come up, as well as relationship with your children or children in general. Also the topics of creativity, joy, happiness, fun, sexuality, and romance are sometimes indicated in this house. There could be changes happening in those areas. Now, that's a quick rundown of your 12 signs, depending on your rising sign. It's going to configure to the whole sign houses of your birth chart. Now, last but not least, remember that Mercury is a god of highways and merchants and thieves and marketplaces, and also the constant transformation of information, transfer of information. Mercury is also related to debates and back and forth games on courts like basketballs, anything that features a lot of kind of back and forth movement and multiplicity and change, usually with a lesson, a message, or the chaos that comes from Mercury is kind of divine. It can mix you up, it can confuse you, it can be, just multiplicities abound, but there's usually a message in the midst, so you have to listen for it and watch for the trickster energy. It can also be generally time where something about if you're doing business, if you have your own business, anytime Mercury is retrograde, something can shift in your business, or especially in things related to technology or information or media. It's also a great time to examine the patterns of speech and communication in relationships and the need for emotional intelligence in our communication. So that's what I've got for you for your Mercury retrograde in Cancer. Please tell me how you're doing. Leave your comments in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you and just hear how you're already feeling or experiencing this if you are. And stay tuned for more on the upcoming eclipse and lots of other good stuff to come up. We've got another Jupiter-Pluto conjunction coming, so lots more to talk about. All right, take it easy, everyone.